Okay. Right, I'm going to give it 1 minute. Okay. Right, can I start?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Good. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Next Steps Foundation extension lecture. The title tonight is Britain in a Dangerous World. The Next Steps Foundation aims to widen education and not least widen opportunities. And the idea of these extension lectures really is to inspire, broaden academic horizons, foster special interests, and most of all, just lift the lids off people's heads. So this evening, we are talking about Britain in a dangerous world. We're living in a world where Putin said liberalism is dead. We are returning to great power rivalries, the post-1945 sort of liberal order, which in some ways had the idea of multilateral institutions, such as the UN, WTO, trading organizations, and most of all, having a rules-based international order. Well, all of this seems to be in retreat. We see the rise of an assertive China, in many ways who would like to play, not by other people's rules, but potentially its own, and sees the world in a different way. We are seeing a Russia, which is revanchist, resurgent, and most of all disruptive. And in some ways, we're now, I suppose, recovering from what was a Trumpian world where America, seemingly, the world's superpower, or in some ways maybe the guardian of liberal values, reverted to a different way of seeing the world in a very transactional way. So we're now also trying to make sense of the world in terms of what's happened after Trump. And in all of this, somewhere is Britain. If you've looked at the map, it's a little island. And we've just had Brexit, which has really put the cat among the pigeons in all sorts of directions. So this really does beg the question. We're in a dangerous world, a turbulent world, and quite where does Britain fit in, and how, in some ways, does Britain ensure its prosperity, security, going forward against this backdrop. So, and it's also a huge pleasure this evening to welcome Dr. Karen von Hippel. She's the first woman and non-Briton to hold the position of the Director General of the United Services Institute, which is a defence-based think tank in Whitehall in London. Initially started by the Duke of Wellington. It's also Prospect's Think Tank of the Year. And prior to joining RUSI, she served for nearly 6 years in the US Department of State as a senior advisor in the Bureau of Counterterrorism, then as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, and finally as Chief of Staff to General John Allen, Special President Envoy for the Global Coalition to Counter ISIL. Prior to that, she coordinated the post-conflict reconstruction project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and was a senior research fellow at the Center for Defence Studies, King's College London. She has also worked for the UN, the EU, and has several publications to her name, including Democracy by Force, US Military Intervention in the Post-Cold War World, which was shortlisted for the RUSI Westminster Medal in Military History. She holds degrees from the LSE, University of Oxford, and Yale. We are also joined by Professor Stephen Woolcock. He's a lecturer in international political economy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Just as we are, I suppose, still reeling from Dominic Cummings's outlining of the shortcomings of the Prime Minister. Well, in some ways, the most competent Prime Minister of recent times is a graduate of the LSE, Jim Hacker. He also heads the LSE's International Trade Policy Unit, which coordinates research on trade topics runs training programs for practitioners, and organizes seminars that bridge the gap between academic research on trade and policy. His previous posts include Senior Research Fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, and Deputy Director for International Affairs and the Confederation of British Industry. He's worked as a consultant and advisor to a number of international organizations, including the EU and national governments. His books include Trade and Investment Rulemaking, The Role of Regional and Bilateral Agreements, and The New Economic Diplomacy. So we are very lucky to have some incredibly distinguished guests, and it's certainly, in some ways, an honor to be hosting this discussion tonight. Bill Clinton's, one of his great strategy advisors always said to him, "It's the economy, stupid." So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Professor Woolcock to start this evening's discussion on Britain in a Dangerous World.
Okay, Owen, thanks very much indeed. I'll talk for about 10 minutes. If anyone wants to interrupt with a question, that's also fine, but obviously there will be scope for questions and answers afterwards. So I'm going to talk about the international economy, and I will focus on international trade because it's difficult to talk about the whole of the international economy in something less than 10 minutes. The first question is, why is the trading system does it constitute a dangerous place to be? The key point here is that trade conflicts can spill over into political conflicts. Economic instability can lead to an increased focus on domestic interests and a reduction in willingness to cooperate internationally. So you have a decline in international cooperation. And the classic parallel that's often used and often overused, in fact, is the comparison with the interwar period, where the collapse of the economic system and in the trading system in particular contributed to the trend towards greater conflict and World War II. As I say, that's slightly overused, but we are in a position now where I think it's fair to say that the trading system is as badly off as it has been since 1948, since the establishment of the Bretton Woods system that Owen talked about, the creation of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that many people would argue provided the basis for progressive economic development and growth in the post-1948 period. Why is this important? Why is a rules-based system important? Well, without the predictability that you get from a rules-based order in the economy, there will be less investment. And also issues, assuming you want to strike a balance between economic growth and sustainability, you also need an agreement on what the rules should be, what the balance should be between commercial interests and environmental interests. These have to be broadly agreed at an international level. Otherwise, individual countries will take decisions on what is fair and what is the right balance. So we can go into this in more detail, but the case is generally made that a rules-based order helps promote greater cooperation, prosperity for all countries that participate. And this is a bit independent, really, of where you stand on how liberal this should be, how free trade should be, how free investment should be. We're talking here about predictability rather than the degree of liberalism. So we had, post-1948, we had a trading system that developed progressively into this rules-based order, which reached a high point in the mid-1990s, with the creation of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which in many respects established one of the strongest regimes, international regimes, certainly in international economic relations, but one of the strongest regimes that we've seen. This had clear rules. It also had an independent form of dispute settlement resolution. So disputes weren't settled by who was the more powerful, but there was an independent form of adjudication of disputes. So we have this progressive evolution up to the mid-1990s with the creation of the WTO. What has happened since then, and progressively really, it hasn't happened overnight, has been a greater awareness that the international economy is becoming more of a multipolar economy rather than a multilateral economy. The cooperation in the immediate post-1945 period was established thanks to the dominance of the US, what we call US hegemony. That was replaced in the 1970s, 1980s by the leadership or hegemony of the industrialized countries, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries, that, if you like, provided the framework for the international economy. And others supported this, other countries supported this, because it represented an international public good. In other words, it provided a predictability, open trading system that countries like Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and developing countries benefited from. So they were willing to go along and support this, even though the rules were largely shaped by the leading capitalist economies. Now, this worked fairly well up until the mid-1990s, but since the mid-1990s, we have this multipolar system. And the reasons the international trading system is in difficulties now is that it's struggling to come to terms with this multipolar order. The US is no longer able to shape the rules, and as a result, its interest in sustaining the existing trade regime is declining. And under Donald Trump, there was active efforts to destroy the multilateral trading system. The European Union is one of, so we have three major poles, if you like. There's the US, the European Union, and China. Simplification, of course, but that's the broad picture. The European Union is a big market, but by itself, it can't support a multilateral system. It's trying to work with other countries to build sort of coalition to support multilateralism. China has gone along with multilateralism because it also benefited from open markets. It exports a lot to the US, to Europe, to Japan. But China supports what we have to date. And the question is how the international system can develop and how the rules-based system can evolve to deal with current issues in international trade. So one illustration of current issues in international trade is the whole impact of the digital economy. Now, there's a so-called bicycle theory of the trading system. And this, again, another simplification, but I've only got 10 minutes. This is that you have to keep moving, otherwise you fall over on a bicycle. Some people can do track stands, but I find it's very difficult. So you have to keep moving, and you have to keep moving in a trading system, because we're arguably in what people call now the fourth industrial revolution. And this is all related to the influence of the digital economy. One or two examples of how this changes things. So first of all, the big multinational companies are no longer the oil majors or chemical companies or General Electric or Boeing. They're digital economies. They're Google, Amazon, Facebook. These are the big multinational, big forces in the corporate world. And they have a dominant influence on international markets. Another way in which things have changed is that with the growth of free flow of data across borders, you have a decline in tariffs. So how do you impose a tariff on the flow of data? The free flow of data across borders so undermines the existing structures that have survived for a long time in the trade field in the form of tariffs, but they also undermine the ability to regulate services sectors. They undermine existing competition policies, and they make it easier for companies to engage in tax planning. This is one of the areas that's most well understood. In other words, it's easier for digital companies to plan their tax in such a way that they are in fact paying less tax. So you have a position in which Amazon is paying far less tax than the high street competitors. So you have distortions in the international markets, and you have distortions in national markets. Digitalization also changes the balance in terms of national security issues. Some countries want to control data for reasons of national security. You have issues such as cybercrime, etc., and this sort of spills over very much into the security field. So, in other words, there is a need to come to some broad understanding on what sort of rules you establish for dealing with the digital economy. Now, this is under discussion. There are discussions at the moment on e-commerce. But to illustrate my point about the multipolar economy, let me just go through the three poles in the digital sphere. So you have the US. The US is shaped by what I would call industry-led market capitalism. You have the big US majors, Facebook, Amazon, Google. These all want to see free flow of data across markets because they want to harvest data. Data is value, adds value. So they want to harvest the data from your telephones, your iPhones, and commercialize that. But they can only do that if there is a free flow of data across borders. And therefore, these companies which have what we call first mover advantage are shaping the US position in terms of how we deal with the digital economy. So the US, industry-led market capitalism. You then have China, as many people say, is state-led capitalism. China wants to catch up. It can do so more effectively than many developing countries have done because of the size of the economy and the scale of the state's role in the economy. But China wants to use its own domestic data, and this is significant, massive. It wants to use that to develop its own apps, its own software, and therefore provide the basis for high-tech sectors in which it can compete internationally. China also wants to control the flow of data because for political reasons. So those two poles. Then you have the EU. The EU is what I would call a rules-based market capitalism. In other words, it's about markets, but it's within a framework of rules. And what the EU is doing is to promote what it calls a digital single market. This is equivalent to the single market that we've heard so much about in the Brexit debate. The single market was for goods, essentially, and to some extent services. The EU is now developing a digital single market as a means of competing both with the US and with China. And it's introducing things like a digital tax and stronger competition to deal with the US majors. So we have these three poles. Obviously, there are questions there about the other countries, developing countries, how they fit in. But the topic of today is Britain in a dangerous world. So the question is, where does Britain lie in this choice? Which pole best reflects British interests? The interests of the broader British economy? And which pole, if you like, offers the best prospect of achieving the global Britain strategy that the British government is pursuing? Is it the US? Is it the EU? Or is it China? And we can discuss this more in detail. I hope that's not too long.
Thank you, Professor Woolcock, for certainly giving the economic slant on an increasingly complicated world. Now handing over to Dr. Van Hippel from RUSI, who I think will be coming at the problem from a slightly more political and security-based slant.
Okay, thank you, Owen, and it was great to hear you, Professor Woolcock. It was quite interesting. I think I have more questions for you, but I suppose that's not fair to the students because they're the ones that are going to ask the questions. But I think what I'm going to say should complement in many ways what you said. And what I wanted to do is talk a bit about the geopolitical changes over the last decade or so and how that has impacted international security. And I'll try to be brief as well and do it in three short chunks. So the first chunk is what happened in the last, during the Trump administration, basically, how things changed, including the November 2020 elections and the aftermath of the violence in the US on January 6th. A bit more then about what we can expect from the Biden administration, which, as you can all imagine, is quite different from the Trump administration. And then what might that mean for the UK? I think issues such as China and the rest of the world, Russia, et cetera, maybe we can talk about in the Q&A because it's not entirely, I don't know what you're all interested in. So it'd be good to hear from all of you. So just briefly, I think we all know, and as Professor Woolcock mentioned, the world has changed significantly in the last 4 years. It had been changing, obviously, for longer than that. But we have a more complex, a more fragmented, a more multipolar world. We have China emerging as a major geopolitical rival, emerging much quicker than many people had anticipated before. And China, as we know, challenges a traditional way of managing international affairs. They even offer a competing governance model for other countries. Developing countries can say, well, look, I can change economically, but I don't have to open politically. I don't have to respect human rights. I can follow the China model versus the model that we all assumed was going to be the model for most parts of the world, which was our model of, democracy, values, respecting human rights, et cetera. So they're competing in a significant way, and they're offering a competing governance model that's proved to be successful economically. Now, so these changes had been happening, but really what happened during the Trump administration, in my view, is that Trump actually accelerated a process that had been underway. As I think as all of you know, the US really had been providing a traditional global leadership role since the end of the Second World War. And in many ways, the US started to withdraw earlier than the Trump administration. In many ways, I mean, I'm not an historian, but I would say you can probably point to the Iraq War in 2003, when many countries thought the US was really entering a war illegitimately. The excuses that it used, we found out later, were not true. And so many traditional American allies started to not follow the US as much and started to change their views. During the Obama period, and I worked for President Obama, there was certainly a belief by many, by Obama, that he didn't want to repeat the mistakes of Bush. He didn't want to get involved in wars that were preemptive. But because he was pulling back so much, he almost pulled back too much. And there were a number of areas where actually I disagreed with his foreign policy, and others did as well who worked in the State Department. And you may have remembered there was a phrase that was used to describe Obama as leading from behind. But because he wasn't doing as much, because he wasn't being assertive in the traditional American way, when the Syrian civil war happened, when the Russians invaded Crimea, etc., because he didn't do the traditional things to try to change that, many other countries basically, they watched America and they learned as much from inaction as action. So this trend had been underway, but then Trump basically threw fuel on the fire. I think you all remember he preferred to work with his authoritarian buddies. He wanted to withdraw from NATO. He didn't, he insulted traditional American allies. I don't need to go through all the examples, but he certainly was a sharp change from traditional Democratic and Republican politics in the United States and at the global level. And so while America basically withdrew from its global leadership role during the Trump administration, no other country or groupings of countries filled that void. So you didn't see the UN coming in and saying, okay, we'll provide leadership. Let's all gather around and talk about how we can work together to manage the COVID crisis or to manage this other crisis, or what are we all going to do about China? It was really more fragmented because no other country or grouping came in. The EU didn't do that, and individual countries didn't do that. And so that's also, in my view, why we did see much more fragmentation at the global level. Now, if Trump had won a second term, we might have seen those countries coming together. And I had a number of discussions with allies of the United States, of the United Kingdom, and they were just sort of waiting for someone to provide leadership, but they were all very nervous about trying to do it themselves. So then we had the 2020 elections in the United States, and we all know what happened. But what's significant to me about these elections is that the results, they can give one cause for worry if one believes in the rules-based order that Professor Woolcock was talking about. So Biden, as we know, was the first candidate to defeat an incumbent in more than 25 years. More Americans voted in this election than they have in over 120 years. Biden got over 81 million votes and Trump got 74 million. Now that's the highest and the second highest in US history. But this also means that Trump did even better in the popular vote this time than he did in 2016. So he got 11 million more votes this time. And that means something, which I'll get to in a minute. We saw he took over the Republican Party wholesale, a party that stood for conservative values, for small government spending, for a robust international presence. All of that was thrown out of the way, and it really became a party with no real strategy. In fact, if you looked at the Republican Party platform from last summer, before the elections, before the Republican convention, there was no platform at all. So, he just felt that he could just say whatever the policy would be. He didn't need to come up with a strategy nor try to implement it. The Republicans also did very well at the local levels in many states, and they did pretty well in the House of Representatives, narrowing the gap from before. As we know, the Senate is equally divided, with the vice president, supplying the vote in case of a tie. But it's not so simple. It doesn't mean all the Democrats will vote one way and the Republicans all will vote another way. So it's in a sense, that's actually a good result, because hopefully it should force more bipartisanship. But for me, what was interesting about that result is it was obvious that people were tired of Trump, the person. I think we were all exhausted waking up and dealing with another tweet or another insult, or it was just anxiety producing for so many people. But Trumpism, whatever it was that he represented, has lived on and may live on for the foreseeable future. And so I think what's important about that is to think about, and we can talk about it more later, people are interested, is that is for America's allies, and I include the UK, is they're very concerned that, okay, we're happy to have Biden. Now, let me go through what we expect from a Biden presidency and what we're seeing, and then I'll talk about the implications for allies. So I think, we all know that Biden's top priorities when he started were the economy, reviving the economy, dealing with the pandemic, and the deep, deep divisions in America, some of which I mentioned earlier. Every single one of those is a huge challenge. I mean, I think Professor Woolcock would make a very interesting case about how we all of our economies get out of a situation where the spending has just been so enormous by governments not seen since the Second World War. How do these economies recover? I'm sure they can, and hopefully they will, but it's going to be an enormous challenge. Now, of course, foreign policy was not on his list of priorities, but he has a very strong team. They all have a lot of experience in government, and Biden himself actually has decades of foreign policy experience. He was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. As we all know, he was vice president. And so he comes to office with established relationships with world leaders, opposition leaders. He understands crises abroad. And he doesn't really need the tutorial that Obama and Trump both needed at the start of his presidency. I think the other good thing about Biden for a divided America is that he is very centrist. He does come from a blue-collar background. He doesn't look down on anybody. He treats everybody the same. He took the train every day to the Amtrak every day to and from the Senate back home to Delaware. He knew every train conductor. So, he really is, he can reach into that pool of the population that found Trump so attractive. But in terms of foreign policy, I do think that allies are very happy. So it's almost a return to the pre-Trump era. It's, climate change, it's multilateralism, it's let's work together on China, let's rejoin the WHO, let's extend arms control treaties, let's get back into the Iran deal. So I think for the next 4 years, it's, you may or may not agree with every position he'll take, but it's more of a traditional American foreign policy. Now, the challenges, I think, for America's allies, including the UK, is when Biden says America's back, the real issue is that it can't be a reset and return to normal. The world has changed, as I said. We're not in the same world before. It's not U.S. is the sole superpower. We have China nipping at the heels, and we have other countries and groupings of countries. Oh, it's my dog. Sorry. Hang on a second. Shh. Hang on. Lulu. Shh. Stop. All right. Okay, sorry. This happens all the time. You're going to get to see my puppy. Okay, so we have China. We have other powers that are really pushing back and are asserting themselves in ways that they didn't do before. And allies are saying, and I've talked to a friend who works for, a very close American ally, who works for the president or the prime minister of that country, and he'll say things like, look, we're happy to have Biden. We're happy to be back to where we were, but guess what? Trump had a lot of votes. He's still very popular out there. We have to prepare for another Trump-like person, if not Trump himself, taking over. We need to show that we can be that we can survive on our own without America. In a similar way to how the professor was talking about, countries trying to not be so reliant and bringing some of their critical industries closer to home. In politics as well, the UK, other countries need to figure out how they're going to develop their policies on their own. I think the muscle memory in the UK was, okay, something happens globally. What is America doing and what is Europe doing? Well, the European Union is no longer part of the British partnership, and America at the moment is reliable, but it may not be reliable later. So I think I'm going to shut up there so we have time to hear from people. But it's just, I guess to conclude, really, I would say that it's a very different world right now. I think, the UK needs America, and America needs the UK. I think America needs to show to countries, and I'm sure politicians are saying this, diplomats are saying this to Americans, look, we need to have some sort of guarantee. If we sign up for all these deals with you, that you won't just pull out again in 3 or 4 years, right? So you need to show that you're a reliable partner. And that's really going to be, I think it will be a more humble America, at least under this administration. So thank you very much, and very nice to listen to Steve, and look forward to questions from all of you guys, and maybe hopefully see somebody's faces.
Thank you. So the world is altered, the world has changed, and does Britain have a place in it? For questions, please, if you can go into your Q&A function, please do type in questions so they can build up, and I can refer to them. I'm not quite sure how it works, so if you could please maybe just put your name at the end of the question. I'm going to start off by asking some questions, and then I'm going to open things up to the floor as we go. In some cases, I might just take some of your written questions and throw them in. But there's other ways. If I can put you on the spot and you can unmute yourselves, it'd be wonderful if you could actually ask your question in person. So obviously we've been talking about Britain in a dangerous world, and the focus has been very much so far on the US, which I suppose just underlines the fact that it's a dominant player in whatever form of global order we might have. So Karen, just I suppose returning to you. We've talked about the fact in some ways we're coming out of a post-Trumpian world. You have talked about Biden and his presidency, but I suppose his greatest quality in some ways was he wasn't Trump, and we still have a divided America. But to what extent is Biden's administration going to be boring?
Well, I think we want a bit of boring. I think, going back to one of the points Steve made earlier about the rules-based order, in politics, actually predictability really matters. And predictability is incredibly important for enforcing a rules-based order. So if you understand that if you invade another country, or if you break the rules, or you violate a trade agreement, there will be repercussions, then countries are more likely to follow those rules. And so, during the Trump period, there were no rules. So I think, look, Biden, there is still a majority of Republicans do not admit that Biden actually won the election. They still think the election was stolen. And that's something he's going to have to deal with and work on. There's a very small number of Republicans who publicly went out to say that Trump won. And you saw what happened to Liz Cheney, who basically said, Trump lost the election, and they just kicked her out of one of her seats. But back to what you're talking about in terms of the UK and the US, I think, whatever Boris Johnson's relationship was with Trump, and it was probably one of the better ones that Trump had with a traditional ally, one of the things Boris did even before Biden came in was reach out to America. So first thing he did was he published his Green Industrial Revolution. We're going to commit to climate change. We're going to commit in a major way to trying to push back on climate change. That's something he knew that President Biden cared a lot about. And then he also upped defense spending. And that was also a message to the United States that we're, even though we may have had a relationship with Trump, we're here to work with you. And I think it's important for the UK because the UK is trying to figure out, who will its partners be? What kind of trade agreements is it going to have globally? What kind of power can it project? Is it a middle power country? What does middle power mean? All those sorts of questions are still part of the dialogue here in the debate.
And can I put this question over to Steve? Apart from Biden being boring, are we going to see something of maybe a bit more emphasis on a rules-based order, a less transactional America? What's the economic impact of Biden going to be globally?
Thanks very much. Yes. Well, Biden, as a person, he might be boring, but some of his policies are not so boring, actually. I mean, massive reflation is a significant shift. And if it's successful and if he can get it through Congress, I think that's going to have quite a significant impact. But from the point of view of international economic relations, you're right, Owen. I mean, what characterized Trump was his transactional approach. In other words, short-term thinking, trying to do deals rather than reach agreement or reach some kind of broad understanding with other parties. But the underlying structural factors in the world economy, if I can put it that way, haven't changed. So even if you talk to the sort of more liberal establishment in the US, they will share many of the views that China poses a strategic challenge to the US and that the US has to respond. And that has implications for how the US sees the international system. So although Biden will certainly seek to cooperate, he talks about multilateralism, he talks about cooperation, but the question in my mind is whether this will be, how inclusive will this be? Will it be an attempt to re-establish a kind of US-centered order in the international economy based on like-minded states? And this, in a sense, is trying to re-establish kind of OECD hegemony or leadership I was talking about earlier on. Or will it be a genuine multilateralism, which means reaching out to try and reach agreement with China and India and Brazil and developing countries? And I think that's a crucial issue, because if it is simply trying to re-establish a kind of like-minded coalition, and this is something that sort of plays into this is in the game plan of the UK that is supporting this kind of thing, and we'll see more of it, I think, in the G7 that's coming up in June. So the question is, how do you try to reach an international agreement, a broad consensus on how to manage the international economy when you have significant differences of interest? And Trump was very critical of the Chinese approach, very attacking the whole idea of state-led capitalism. But ultimately, it has to, if you want an inclusive order, you have to try to find a way of accommodating those different national economic models. So, in short, I think the shift from Trump to Biden hasn't changed the underlying structural elements that shape US interests. And I agree with Karen when she says that there is this uncertainty now about what will come later on, and how much can you rely on the US? If you say, let's have a like-minded coalition, what happens if you have another Trump figure coming along, because that would just blow it apart again?
So we've talked about the US special relationship, a term I suppose initially coined by Churchill, And maybe in Britain, one puts more emphasis on the special than in America. But how special is this relationship? And I suppose, given the fact that Biden doesn't seem to be as overtly pro-Britain as Trump, what implications does this have for Britain?
Is that to me or to Karen?
We'll start with you, then I'll flip over to Karen.
I think you have to look at it it depends on the policy area. So if you're looking at international trade, then it's sort of markets make a difference. So how big your market is, and therefore the EU single market is more important than the UK. So it's not special. If you're looking at shaping the rules, then you have to reach an accommodation with Europe, really. This like-minded group of countries means reaching an accommodation with Europe. So again, it's the EU that has a special relationship in that context. But on security issues, where the EU has a much weaker profile on foreign policy, then you will have probably a different kind of relationship.
Over to Karen, and also I wonder, what opportunities are there for a post-Brexit Britain within this relationship?
Look, the special relationship means a lot of things to a lot of people. I think, as you say, obviously it means more in some ways to the Brits than it does to the Americans, but it actually means quite a lot to the Americans. I mean, it's very wide and it's very deep. And so if you have on almost any international issue, you'll find diplomats calling each other, either from the embassy in Washington calling the State Department, or calling, through the Five Eyes, which is it's the intelligence sharing between the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Canadians, the Americans, and the Brits. But if you're in Kenya and the two ambassadors are worried about what's happening in Kenya, you'll find the British and the Americans often talking to each other all the time. So it's a wide, and it happens with soldiers. They're often seconded to each other's countries. They train together, they study together. So it's a wide and deep relationship. And when I was working on the coalition, the counter-ISIL coalition, it was just after Baghdadi took over Mosul, and we were all trying to figure out how do we push back. It would often be the Brits that came up with a number of very good ideas about how to go forward. And behind the scenes, they would be calling up my boss or whoever to try to negotiate that. So, I think as Professor Woolcock was saying, you have to separate on the trade side and the economic side from the political side. And of course, on security, Britain has the strongest defense capability in Europe. I mean, the French are close, but Britain's still stronger. And Britain is also very strong on counterterrorism type of security and intelligence, GCHQ signals intelligence type. So that partnership is also very strong. So, I actually think that we're all kind of feeling our way through this new world and trying to figure out what it all means. I mean, Europe is now at a disadvantage without the UK in it. Germany's still going to be a very strong power, but in many ways, Europe was the anchor for Europe and kind of pushed back on some of the more, some of the tendencies where they felt that the Europeans were trying to become one superstate. And now that's gone. It's not clear what's going to happen in Europe. And you have European countries like Hungary and Poland, et cetera, that have nationalist leaders that aren't that interested in collaborating, that probably have a stronger, well, not Poland, but certainly Hungary has a stronger relationship with China than it does with the UK, and is likely to try to block anything the EU wants to do on China, for example. So it's not clear to me you'll have this unified EU going forward. You're going to have fragmentation in the EU. You're having the UK trying to figure out what its role will be going forward and how it's going to, what it wants to prioritize and spend money on, because it doesn't, every country needs to focus. And the US trying to build back and make friends again and say, that was a blip. Let's hope that doesn't happen again. We're all in a different place. We also have, don't forget, we have the multilateral system that's just basically failed in many ways. I used to be a big believer in the UN. I worked for the UN in places like Somalia and Kosovo. I've seen the great work the UN can do. And the UN has just underperformed in a significant way across the board these last 4 or 5 years. I know the WHO has done a decent job in many ways in dealing with this pandemic, but overall, we've lost faith in many ways in the UN. And so it's, a number of changes will need to be made as we shift into this world where it's not necessarily just about how many tanks you have or nuclear weapons. It's actually how advanced you are in quantum computing, how good your AI capability is, how good your cyber capability. So there are these advanced industries that may propel countries to superpower status more than weapons will going forward.
Returning, I suppose, to economics, there's been one or two questions. One from I think it's from Charlie. Do you anticipate the use of trade tariffs to change within the next 5 years? So linking that, looking at the WTO, do we see future success with WTO negotiations, or is the WTO at breaking point? Steve.
Okay, thanks for the question. Well, I talked, there are two key issues facing the trading, well, three key issues facing the trading system, if you like. One is dealing with the vaccine issue and the goods related to vaccines, and making sure that there is not a recourse to sort of nationalist responses. And the trading system has to deliver on that as well. Another question is trade and climate change. Because if you move towards ambitious targets on reductions in carbon emissions, this runs the risk of other countries gaining a competitive advantage on what they call carbon leakage. In other words, countries will be able to compete because they have lower costs if they don't move towards at the same speed towards reducing carbon emissions. And so that's the second big issue. The third issue is the whole digital question, how you regulate the digital economy. So on those issues, on taking the digital one first, there are negotiations, as I say, taking place now on e-commerce. And these include the US, the EU, China, Brazil, a range of developing countries. So there is a real effort to reach an agreement, largely pushed by a group of countries such as Canada, Japan, Singapore. In other words, the smaller economies that will be more damaged from the collapse of the trading system. They want to make sure that there is a basic framework that on which you can build cooperation. So the aim was to reach an agreement before the end of this year. There may be some progress on certain issues on e-commerce, but we have difficulties going much further because of the strategic dimension. So you have, for example, the question of whether countries would be able to take, to block data flows for national security reasons, and how you define what a national security reason is. What is a national security, grounds for national security? And if that is, so that's one challenge. The other one is the famous Huawei issue. In other words, 5G, and how you resolve those kind of tensions. So there is some prospect for progress at a WTO level, but it's finely balanced. And those wanting an ambitious agreement, meaning a liberal agreement, such as the United States, will peel off and do something else if the agreement in the WTO doesn't look as though it's going to be satisfying US interests. In other words, they will conclude an agreement with Asia Pacific, or they'll conclude an agreement through bilateral agreements in order to effectively keep the difficult parties like India and China out of the negotiations. So that's where we are at the moment. That's why it's a critical phase in the whole debate. I think, but sorry, was it Charlie asked the question? So you mentioned tariffs. This is my bête noire in trade policy. I mentioned tariffs because tariffs aren't really the issue anymore. Well, unless you're a beef farmer in Scotland or farming lambs in Wales and about to be outcompeted by Australian competition with a UK-Australia trade agreement. So tariffs play a fairly minor role in trade policy these days. It's about how you regulate markets. And this was never understood in the whole Brexit debate. And I'm afraid British politicians still don't understand it properly. It's about regulation, and it's about getting the balance between how you pursue social, environmental policy objectives whilst pursuing commercial policy objectives through regulation rather than just tariffs.
Now, I've got quite a few questions coming in. So one of your surnames is iPhone. Nick, I've got lots and lots of questions from you. So I was wondering, could you unmute yourself and make some noise? And then hopefully if you can appear on screen, you can ask two of your questions live, if that's possible. Nick, hello.
Yeah, yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, Nick. Fire away. Welcome.
Welcome. Yeah, thank you.
Oops, he went back on mute. Nick,
Nick,
you went on
Nick,
mute.
you're muted. Nick, can you unmute your sound?
Apologies for that. The moment I'm using this on my iPhone, I do apologize. And each time I go to look at my questions, because I've done loads of them, to try and pick one, it switches off the audio. I think one of my questions was along the lines of stability and order in a world of disruptors. Is that really the answer, or is there another way? And that could be to either.
Thank you, Nick.
Did you have any other questions?
Let's do that one.
I'll go find another one. Hang on a second.
Other people to fit in.
Is there another way? Is there another way rather than stability and order? Well, I simplistically, yes, I suppose it's hegemony. So if I'm talking about the trade in order, and to some extent, I think, well, Karen will have to speak for security and politics. But if you have one hegemon, one dominant economy, one dominant player who can shape the trading system, shape the international economy, then that provides the order, if you like. But my argument these days is that that's not really an option because we have this multipolar system. Now, there are some people who would like to return to that, as I say, to return to a kind of like-minded group of countries that will have significant economic and political muscle to be able to shape the world order. But it's not, I don't think that's credible anymore because countries like India, it's not just China, but India, other emerging powers are not ready to accept that. So this is why I place emphasis on a rules-based system.
Can I actually ask a question to Professor Woolcock based on what Nick said? Because I actually think a related piece of this, and something I'm always curious about, I don't understand very well, is cryptocurrencies and the role that they could play. Now we know China is trying to launch its own cryptocurrency, and if it succeeds in, I mean, can it succeed in disrupting the dollar? So at the macro level, kind of following on Nick's question, can it succeed in disrupting the dollar, and then would that make a big difference?
Yes, thanks, Karen. I think you have to differentiate between policy areas, and I think the US is still stronger in monetary policy, and if you like, the transatlantic economy, transatlantic link is still able to shape the international financial system more than it's able to shape the international trade and investment order. That it remains to be seen. I mean, for some time, there's been a debate about whether this kind of influence is in decline and the role of the dollar is in decline. And many people have announced the decline in the dollar, but it hasn't really happened yet. So I think you have to differentiate. I think Karen, you were talking about US leadership when it changed. I would go back even later and say that US leadership of the trading system was already weakening in the 1970s. Wow. So, but it depends, and you have to look at the environment as well. And if the US is now has aspirations of providing more leadership in the international environment, so it may be strong in that sector as well. But, on cryptocurrencies, I mean, there has been a shift towards more use of the yuan, and in part, Chinese foreign investment is often linked to trade denominated in Chinese currency. So there's a progressive erosion of the role of the dollar, and I think it will come in time.
I've got a question here specifically for Karen from Marina. Marina, could you appear?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, hello, Marina.
I was going to ask Karen if she thinks that there are any element of Trump's foreign policy that Biden should aim to emulate. So does she think that it's necessary to be somewhat isolationist and confrontational in order to handle like the pandemic, recession and threats from China and Russia?
So thank you, Marina. Good question. I have sort of two answers to that. First is, I don't really think Trump had a foreign policy. He had gut beliefs about things, but I personally don't think he understood how you get from a strategy to a policy, and that involves a whole team of diplomats and negotiators around the world, and he undermined the people that represented America in so many ways throughout that it was almost impossible for foreign leaders to speak to a cabinet member or an ambassador because Trump could easily undermine his own colleague. And so when Trump was pushing back on China, it was never entirely clear to me what his strategy was on China. He didn't think there was he didn't like the trade deficit with China, but he didn't really have a plan for what he was going to do besides do what he does in business, which is, lots of posturing and pushing back. So I think, look, there are some areas where Biden has a similar view, but I think the way Biden would do it is different. So China, Russia, climate change, the pandemic, all of these challenges are too big for America on its own to solve on its own or to manage on its own. Most of these can't even be solved. They need to be managed. And I think we saw that with China. Trump tried to push back on China by himself. He didn't bring in allies to work with him. They sort of announced this is what we're doing, but they didn't try to bring in countries to work together. Biden will do the opposite. He'll push back on China, but he'll also do it in partnership with allies. And because I think he does recognize that these countries are too powerful, these issues are too powerful to handle on its own. And there's obviously more legitimacy when you do it with other countries. So in some ways, I think some of the instincts Trump had were not bad. Look, I'll give him credit. He was the first American president to push back publicly on China. and others tiptoed around it. They were nervous, they were afraid for all sorts of reasons. He, for example, reached out and called President Tsai of Taiwan right away, and we've been tiptoeing around the one China policy in the US for decades. And I think, I think in too many ways, all of the US and other countries were afraid of China. So by Trump being quite bold in that way, he empowered other countries, including I think the UK when it pushed back on Huawei, to do the same. And so, let's just say that some of the things that I think he thought were a little bit crazy, one could agree with. His problem was he wasn't able to take an idea from A to implement it on the ground because he would get distracted because he didn't care about the details. And there's so many bureaucrats that can stop so many things in so many clever ways. I mean, I spent 6 years in the State Department, and I learned a lot about how you can say, fabulous idea, we're on it. And then you can come up with all sorts of ways of blocking it.
And Poppy, can you come on and ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hello.
Hi, I just had the question of what is the responsibility of the USA and the UK in helping mitigate and adapt to climate change / global warming compared to countries such as India and China?
Brilliant question. Shall we start with Karen, then move over to Steve on that one?
Sure, although I think Steve would probably have more thoughts on it. I mean, we know that every country, big, powerful countries are pollutants, and some poorer countries, big countries, have huge challenges trying to clean up their or make significant changes in reducing emissions without a lot of help and without hurting a lot of farmers and all sorts of people. So the challenges are quite enormous, and they're different in every country. And so while all these countries can agree on paper, they want to reduce emissions and they want to curb, make the significant changes that we do need to make. I think in practice it's going to be quite challenging without some sort of pooled funds, without pooled expertise to help countries make the changes that are necessary. But I think Steve can talk a lot more about the financial side about this. But certainly it's a global challenge that no country can try to resolve on its own. And the biggest polluters, the US is one, obviously need to make significant changes as well domestically.
Steve.
So the major polluters up until now, and those countries that have essentially developed using fossil fuels as drivers of their economy, have a responsibility for doing more. But the issue is that that's not going to be enough. So there has to be sort of contributions from all parties. But as you're probably aware, Poppy, there is this, it's a distributional effect, and there's a historical distribution here in terms of which countries have contributed most to carbon emissions and climate change. And then there's a question of the current distribution of costs and benefits. So the major economies have to do more, and the US is now. I mean, this was another problem with the Trump administration to simply walk away from the Paris Agreement on climate change. But at least the US has come back now with significant ambitious proposals. There is, however, still a question. There's an issue here which may be worth focusing on, and that is how do you differentiate between countries in terms of their contributions? And it's a problem that runs through all international agreements, but it's certainly one in the case of climate change. So if you look at emissions, pollution on a per capita basis, in other words, how much climate change any individual creates, the US is still higher. India is very low. China is still very low because it's a big population, even though China is growing to be the major emitter of carbon. So it's not a straightforward question, but things have been improving. There is, I think, more scope for cooperation between the US and China on climate change than there is on many other issues. And if you like, if you take my 3 poles, the US is now on board because it wasn't before. The EU has been pushing as a leader in climate change for a long time, and China is now also coming on board. So the prospects for cooperation look better. But you're right. I mean, it's still the developed economies still have to contribute most. And as Karen says, it's dealing with the differentiation issue, because developing countries will say, well, we have a right to develop as well. And why can we not develop using similar technologies? If they're going to develop using different technologies, then they have to have access to those technologies. So solar power, other forms of energy production, and that has to be financed. And this is what all the climate change negotiations are really all about.
Please keep the questions coming in. A question for Karen. I suppose we've talked about Britain is in some ways adrift in, to a greater or lesser degree, in a geopolitically choppy world. What do you particularly see as the greatest security threats to the UK? And also, if you could touch on, what are grey zone threats, and how might Britain, become more resilient?
Great. These are all really good questions, by the way. You guys are comparable to my colleagues at RUSI, so I'm very impressed, given how much younger you are than my colleagues. And some of the conversations that we have at our events, these are all very they're great questions, and they're thoughtful questions. I wouldn't say Britain is adrift necessarily. I think Britain is feeling its way in this post-European world. It's been very comfortable for decades within a certain system. And so it's quite difficult almost overnight to think about how you want, what kind of country you want to be, how you want to surge ahead on your own. It would be a challenge for, especially now that we're in this, in this COVID crisis, that the economies are uncertain coming out of the crisis, with, the Trump administration making enormous changes to what may have been anticipated before. So I think that everyone's a bit adrift. Maybe, that word isn't, it's not a negative word in a sense, because we're just all dealing with so many new challenges. And we're dealing with really rapid advancement of technologies that we don't understand as well as we might have thought we did, or maybe we gave these technologies more positive, like a lot of these tech companies, the Googles and all that, when all these changes were happening with social media and everything, there was always this attitude like, oh, it's a force for good in the world. And I don't think we fully understand the negative impact that these technologies and these companies have had until recently. And so now we're trying to figure that out, while countries such as China or Iran or Russia are trying to actually bifurcate parts of the internet and block off global access. So it's just incredibly complex now. So the threats really that the UK faces are similar threats to what most countries face, and they are, low-tech traditional threats: Russian submarines in the North Sea, Russian planes going, flying over, parts of the UK or parts of Europe, the traditional low-tech threats, through to, let's go back to Russia, interference in elections, interference in the referendum, Brexit referendum, interference in the US election, through to Russian green men who are not really soldiers. They use that term, green men, they take their badges off, but they're still mercenaries almost, when they're still attached to the Russian state. So, the hybrid term you use, or gray zone, is in many sense the threats that we're facing now. And countries like the UK and the United States and European countries have a challenge in pushing back on the Russias and the Chinas, who have all these tools at their disposal, and they're authoritarian states, so they can actually, conduct cyber attacks and then deny it. They can do sorts of things that that our countries may do to a degree, but not in the same way, because obviously the US government doesn't control what Google does, whereas in China, it does control what the tech companies do. So I think this is what many, we just had a huge conference, a huge RUSI conference yesterday called with Strategic Command, which is one of the military commands that tries to deal with these cross-border threats, cross-government threats. How do you pull together all the levers of government power now? How do you work with allies? How do you work, from no tech to low, no tech to high tech? It's incredibly challenging for countries to try to manage that. And so, yes, resiliency, agility, all those terms are what countries need to build, but it's quite difficult when the range of threats that we're all facing has expanded significantly, and the costs of making yourself more resilient and protecting yourself go up exponentially when you're dealing with some of these new technologies, as well as new weapon systems that we may think that we need. So it's a big question, and it's something I think we're all trying to work out now, and we're trying to work out how to protect ourselves from these kinds of threats going forward.
Question over to Steve along the same lines, I suppose, looking more at economic threats, but on a personal level, Gmail has decided it hates me in the last week. At least with Facebook, you might at least feel that Mark Zuckerberg's a person you can direct your ire towards. But in today's world, and particularly looking at international political economy, just how significant are the WhatsApps and the Googles?
Fell into the trap of having to move on. Yes, they are significant. As I was trying to point out, they are the major multinational players. So in the 70s, we looked at the oil companies as being the big transnational actors, as shaping outcomes. Today, it's the digital platforms in many respects, and they have economic power. They have because of their market position, and they have established monopolistic positions. So I mean, Google has had something like 90% of the search engine market for at least 10 years, without anyone challenging that. So if an oil company had 90% of the oil market for 10 years, something would have been done in the past, but it hasn't. As Karen was saying, it sort of crept up on us. And so that Nick asked the question here, I can read in the chat, information age, yes. Data is a commodity. Is it equivalent to tariffs of the future? Well, yes, I think is right. I mean, it is a commodity. Data is the commodity. And because the platforms, if we're talking about artificial intelligence, the development of new technologies is largely driven by access to data. And so you need access to data. If you have access to data, you can strengthen your position. So data is the challenge. And that's why questions such as data protection have become a source of tension in international trade issues. So I do international political economy, and you may ask, well, what is political economy and what is international political economy? Well, it's really, political economy is about who is winning and who is losing, who's benefiting from any given order or any given structure, and who is paying the costs. So Google is important, and the other platforms are important, because they've been benefiting quite significantly from the existing structure. And who is paying the cost? Well, this is the difficult issue, you see, because as a user of Google, you're not paying anything for it. Not in terms of price. You don't pay for when you do a search on Google or when you call someone on WhatsApp. It's all free, isn't it? Of course, but it's data. It's data that that's what you're paying with, really, the information, and it's the data that the platform companies are then commercializing, either in advertising or in other forms. So yes, data is the commodity, and data is key. In terms of how that plays out internationally, that's why, as Karen was saying, well, China and Russia are wanting to cut off the internet for a range of different reasons. One is political, but one is also economic, because they don't want all the Chinese data that is flowing around, they don't want that to be all sucked into Silicon Valley or processed in the US. They want to process it themselves. Hence the control on free data flow that China wants to keep in the current negotiations. Developing countries. So where do developing countries fit in all this? Well, there is this concept of the digital divide, in which, if you like, the core capitalist economies retain the high value added processes, whereas developing countries simply provide data that is then processed in the core countries. This is what developing countries are concerned about in the current fourth industrial revolution. So in the first one, developing countries were the providers of raw materials for the industrialized core. Their concern now is they're simply providing data for the core economies in this fourth industrial revolution. So that issue has to be addressed. So these are the kind of questions that arise in the study of international political economy as it relates to the information age. That's my plug for IPE.
I'm ready to sign up. Count me in. Can I just add, Owen, can I just add a point onto what Stephen was saying? I mean, if you think, just an example of how powerful these companies are, if you think about what happened in the United States on January 6th, when Twitter and Facebook decided to deny their platforms to the President of the United States. Now, you may have agreed that that was the right thing to do, but it's quite extraordinary that private companies are making that decision. They're obviously wrestling with it now because they set up these commissions and they're trying to act like they have some sort of democratic process, but it's quite extraordinary to think that private companies are making decisions at such a significant level now. And that's just what's, in many ways, should be so frightening to so many of us who thought, oh, Facebook's cool and I can connect with my high school buddies. And now all of a sudden, we're seeing, positive, potentially, but also very negative sides to a lot of the capability.
I think this could be the penultimate question of the night. I don't know if we can sort of keep things a little bit brief on this one, just looking at the clock. We're living in a turbulent world. We're in and not least, under the grips of a pandemic, and leadership has never been more challenging, and at the same time, in some ways, always seems to be found wanting. So what qualities of leadership are needed in today's world? And are there any sort of leaders who have certain qualities which actually stand out? Karen.
That's a great question, and I struggle with that a lot too, and I can't decide why we don't have such good leaders now, because maybe it's because politics is so nasty, maybe it's because everything you do and did in your life is now open, so you can get slammed by so many journalists for things that you may have done in your past. And in America, you have to have a lot of money. It's quite different here in that respect, but I don't find that many inspiring leaders right now globally. And for me anyway, I think somebody like Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand for me, she's an inspiring leader. But you're right, there aren't that many. And it's an interesting question to think about what the qualities should be in leadership. But a lot of it is about sympathizing and understanding what's going on in all of our economies, because I don't think any of us really understand as well as we should why why certain people voted for Trump, or the people who voted for Trump and for Obama. You hear a lot of stories, for example, about well, it's all these unemployed people who Trump can speak to. Actually, in many ways, though, the average Trump voter was above average in wealth. So I think we make a lot of assumptions. We make a lot of assumptions about the average Brexit voter in this country. And I don't think personally we understand enough about what's going on between the haves and the have-nots to try to make those changes. And I'm not sure any leaders do either. So I don't even know if I can answer that question, but I do know there's a dearth of good leadership out there. I would agree.
Over to Steve.
I'm not sure I can add much really to that. A difficult question. I suppose if I can just follow on my general theme, I think in terms of managing the international economy, leadership means trying to balance domestic and international interests. And what we've seen too much of recently has been a focus on domestic political imperatives rather than keeping a view on the bigger picture. I wanted to ask I'm not sure if I'm allowed to do this, but I wanted to ask the others here how they see Britain's role in an increasingly dangerous world, because you're the people that count, really.
No, I think we'll try and find some way of actually maybe collating a response to that.
Okay.
Given that we've got to sort of wrap up, I'd like to ask one last question, actually, or two questions at the same time. And I was wondering if you could almost try and answer in one sentence, which is really unfair. Karen, question A. Thinking of the world, what keeps you up at 2 o'clock in the morning? And what advice would you give to any young person, who's about to try and make their way in the world?
Yeah, I ask people that all the time. I have a podcast with, interesting, experienced politicians and others, and I always ask them what advice they give to younger people, because it's such a different world now, and the choices that you have are so different than when I was young. But I do think you just need to be as flexible as possible and try to get as many skills as you can, whether it's data aggregation skills, or how to read a balance sheet, or how to try to understand foreign languages and foreign cultures. I mean, it really depends on the kind of work that you're interested in doing. But I always plug public service, because, well, we don't get paid that much. I find the work very satisfying, as I'm sure Owen would agree. I'm sure he's underpaid significantly too in his job. And what keeps me up at night? Many things keep me up at night, and so I just try not to think about it, because I think sometimes when you know how the sausage is made, it's even more frightening than when you don't.
Steve.
The same question. Oh no. What keeps me up at night? Well, it's a lack of good public servants, really, and a fear that people who start out with good intentions, and we see them all the time. Young people wanting to make a difference, running into how can I put it, obstacles that prevent them from really realizing that. So I think it's important to have to be idealistic, to want to make a difference, and to stick with it, because if you stick with it and you have direction, you will get there in the end.
Look, on this note, it's time to wrap things up. The guillotine has fallen. So to everyone, for questions, for engagement, Thank you very much. I certainly hope that this evening has challenged you to think. Please do think of ways of following up on this interest, particularly if you are considering courses involving politics, international relations, economics. Please do get in touch if we can find ways of helping you.
International political economy as well.
Political economy. And on this note, so apart from saying thank you to everyone who's tuned in this evening, a huge thank you, particularly to Karen and to Steve, for offering so generously your insight, your experience, and your expertise. An absolute tour de force. And I think also thank you to, I think, the star of this evening, Karen's dog. So that was a particularly welcome appearance. So to everyone, thank you very much and good night. And and we look forward to the next lecture in this series. So on that note, good night, everyone.
Thank you, Owen, for your awesome questions too. Bye, everybody. It was fun. Thank you.